So in celebration of my top 10 fantasy series of all time video being about to cross 100,000 views, I figured I'd update it. I'd put out a new video going over my current list of a, higher quality video, not recorded on a MacBook Air with a bad microphone list. That sounds like a good idea, right? Plus in that video, I'm like super not energetic and just coming across poorly. So let's put a better edition out, shall we? So jumping straight into it, for this list, I put no rules in place. Any series could make it on, finished or unfinished. I can put multiple from one author, anything like that. I just want my honest list of top 10 of all time. So the people who left comments on the last one that were like, you shouldn't let your personal preference interfere with this list. What does that even mean? What would I be basing this top 10 list off of then? Sales? Other critics' reviews? No, every top 10 list is subjective, and this is mine. Let's dive into mine. And I'd also love for you guys to leave your top 10 fantasy series of all time in the comments down below. I actually do plan on making a video in the future going over those, tallying points, and seeing what YouTube's top 10 fantasy series of all time are. So jumping in straight away at number 10, we have the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. I just put out a Why You Should Read the First Law series on my channel, and it had a wonderful response because I feel like people who have read these books know what I'm talking about when I say it has some of the best grimdark characters the genre has seen. Also one whose name I can never pronounce. I always want to say Glotka. Apparently it's Glokta or Glokta. I don't know. I mess it up, but I love him. He's an amazing character. And Joe Abercrombie is so consistent with his characters that it really pulls in the reader more deeply to the material than I think almost any other series I've come across can claim. Truly, the First Law trilogy stands head and shoulders above most of its peers in terms of building an atmosphere within a world and having these characters and their relationships move the plot forward in a political type thriller on a caliber that I think is rare to see in any genre. The only reason it's not higher on my list is minor personal preference issues where I don't like things to be this grim dark most of the time, but this was just executed so well that just out of respect, I gotta put it on here. And trust me, if my personal preferences did lean more towards the grim dark, it would be much higher on the list. At number 9, we have a pick that could be a bit controversial. Some people might have a problem with this because it's so far from being finished, and that is the Stormlight Archive. Brandon Sanderson, once again, is setting a high bar here for anyone to cross above him. This is his attempt at a large epic fantasy series, and Stormlight Archive is off to a fantastic start. If the quality stays as consistent as it has been from the beginning here, I could see it going up higher in the list as well. But what really stands out to me for Stormlight Archive is not only Brandon Sanderson's, as always, super deep, relatable characters who have these tumultuous pasts that make you relate to them, his focus on relationships between characters, which will invest you in the world more. But truly for me, Stormlight Archive stands out so well because of the world being built. My God, not only is the Stormlight Archive's world deep and nuanced and bringing levels of mythology and magic and lore in that are previously rarely seen in the fantasy genre, but he's doing it with one of the most engaging and enticing voices within the fantasy genre right now. His writing style is so easy to get into, and he just pulls you in deeper and deeper. I can't spend too much time on this because I gotta go into number 8, and that is Lightbringer by Brent Weeks. This is a bit lower than it was on my last top 10 video, but that's not because I don't hold Lightbringer any lower than I previously did. There's just other series that I've started liking more and more. Lightbringer for me is still one of the most interesting magic systems that the genre has seen. It has really solid character work, amazingly well-written action, and the pulling from real-world science and cultures and mythology is done here on a level that I would say is only comparable to Brandon Sanderson. Brent Weeks is doing a stellar job of crafting culture, world, magic, and having those characters live in it in a way where this world feels so real. And that's in addition to having one of the most hateable, love to hate him villains I've come across in recent memory with Andros Guile. Wow, I hate him. Thank you for writing him. He's magnificent. And if you know me and you know my taste in reading, any good villain is going to pull me in deeper and deeper to the story. Now, on probably a surprise pick for a lot of my fans here at number 7, we have The Dark Tower, a series that I started kind of lukewarm on, but with more and more recent entries has been impressing me again and again. Stephen King is just hacking and slashing his way up my rankings here. And with the last entry I just read, Wolves of the Kala, he really upped his game. I would definitely classify this as alternative fantasy, and in fact, if it was any more alternative fantasy, I might disqualify it from this list because it almost fits zero fantasy tropes. But again, that's kind of why I respect it. I like having an outside the house pick here, and of course Stephen King's work with atmosphere and character is nearly unrivaled with modern writers, and that reflects as well within The Dark Tower. This is also the only entry in this list where I have not finished all the books that have been released, so it's a bit of a risky pick for me. Things could slide downhill and I might regret this, but I don't think that will be the case. The gunslinger is a super engaging protagonist to follow, and the relationship dynamics that are formed and the twists that in true Stephen King fashion you can almost never see coming but always land and improve the story, just elevate Dark Tower continually. Big props there. I can't wait to pick up the next one in the coming months. At number 6, we have Mistborn Era 1. I actually prefer the first 3 books in Stormlight over Mistborn Era 1, but because it's still being worked on and not finished, I had to bump Mistborn Era 1 up because it's complete. It's a done sequence of books, and I've also read Secret Histories, which ties into it, which elevated my love for it even more. This series is not as big, grandiose, and epic as Stormlight, but it is more intimate with the characters you are following, and I will maintain that Vin is one of the best modern fantasy characters we've seen in the genre. Only issue I have with the first 3 Mistborn books is the ending mildly. But even then, it's a personal preference thing and not an actual harsh criticism of this was handled badly. He handled a thing I don't typically enjoy fantasy authors doing remarkably well. And if you have not already, please pick up Mistborn Secret Histories. It elevates the entire first era of Mistborn. It's spectacular. At number 5, we have one that'll be consistent on my top 10 fantasy lists forever, calling it now. It's so rock solid, and that is the Gentlemen Bastards series. Locke and John have the best friendship dynamic I've come across in fantasy, period. Full stop. And if you want me to become invested in your story, have your protagonists have a deep, fleshed out relationship. You can have a really deep character who feels really real, but if they have no connections to the world they are in, the stakes can only get so high. Gentlemen Bastards stakes always feel high because you love not only these 2 characters, but the chemistry between them. So even minor incidents make you worry, and Scott Lynch is not afraid to hurt and damage and threaten his protagonists in ways where you are always afraid for their lives. It's a small, contained world, but atmospheric to an insane degree, with character consistency being a solid 10 out of 10, a dirty, crime-ridden world that is horrifying but beautiful in its execution, with the lens of these joking, carefree but not really thieves at the center. It also might be the best execution of following not necessarily the best good guys that I've come across in fantasy as well, because Scott Lynch does not back down and make them just turn into good guys, which many series that start off following bad guys do. They stay bastards. They are that, up into where the series is now. At number 4, again, we have the grandfather of fantasy. I know in terms of respect and influence, it's always going to be number 1, and I acknowledge that completely. But in terms of personal preference and enjoyment, Lord of the Rings falls at number 4 for me. I enjoyed reading The Lord of the Rings. It's a monolith within the genre. Lord of the Rings has influence in every modern fantasy book you read from almost any continent, because it is a worldwide phenomenon that anyone who's a fan of the genre is going to read and acknowledge its influence. Its shadow is all-consuming. It started so many of the tropes we see today and still love or hate. It is unrivaled in its world building in many ways. Tolkien wrote an entire other book called The Silmarillion, which fleshes out pretty much every detail of the world you could possibly want, as well as countless letters and little blurbs he's written to answer all questions you could pretty much have about the series. And it's not just the world building, it's the depth of lore, it's the character work, and the overall story, and the way all of these things interact, which pretty much makes Lord of the Rings the undisputed king of fantasy forever. It will take something truly epic and legendary to ever even shake Lord of the Rings Rings from being knocked out of that place. Even people who do not enjoy Lord of the Rings always have to acknowledge its influence, especially for allowing us to see that fantasy adaptations can be adapted in a live-action way and be awesome, amazing. Without the Lord of the Rings movies, we probably wouldn't have Game of Thrones, and therefore would not have many more incredible fantasy adaptations where studios invest so heavily. I could make a 3-hour video just talking about the history, depth, incredible execution, Tolkien's life, the influence, everything to do with Lord of the Rings. I won't do that, I need to move on, but it's there, and I'd like to add a little caveat to this that in a purely objective list of what fantasy should be, Lord of the Rings will always be number 1 in my head. But because this is personal taste for me, we're moving on to number 3. And at number 3, we have a controversial series at the moment, but I don't think anyone's going to start trashing the books when I bring them up, and that is A Song of Ice and Fire. Another not finished series, but I don't think anyone will argue with me that it belongs on this list. It has shifted the genre almost entirely towards grimdark, which does not perfectly line up with my taste, but I will admit is bringing a lot of new, fresh air to the genre. Anti-fantasy is on the rise, and I think A Song of Ice and Fire played a large role in bringing that about. Outside of just talking about influence, again, character work here, pretty much perfect. Not talking about the show, in the books, character consistency, development, and evolution is, oh my god, well done. The world, while not the most magical and majestic, is probably the most real and gritty I've come across recently. In terms of grimdark, I think I might enjoy First Law a bit more, but actual respect pretty much has to go to A Song of Ice and Fire for me here. George R. R. Martin's ambition in writing this story was unbelievably large, and all of his steps along the way have been pretty much damn near perfection. There's a few minor nitpicks many fans have, but even the largest criticisms from the fans aren't that bad so far. I mean, people have minor character things here and there, but George R. R. Martin has crafted what might be remembered as the modern day Lord of the Rings. While Lord of the Rings brought around the age of classic fantasy, I think in a few decades, A Song of Ice and Fire will be remembered for bringing around an age of darker, grittier, realer fantasy that might actually appeal to a wider audience. So while my enjoyment reading A Song of Ice and Fire might be a bit lower, my respect and appreciation for it is pretty sky high, because I used to deny its influence, but after looking at modern trends and seeing what's picking up and seeing how even other fantasy series who are in the middle of being developed seem to be taking a turn and being influenced by A Song of Ice and Fire and consequently Game of Thrones is undeniable. It's happening. It's there. Not only for what authors are putting out, but what readers are looking for. At number 2, we have a pick for me that's based off raw enjoyment. I unabashedly love Witcher. Not only the books, but also the video games. I've been going back and playing them, and wow, incredible. Not taking that into account though for this list, I just wanted to point that out. In my review of the last book in the actual timeline of The Witcher, I made the mistake of thinking the series actually continued on canonically past that book, and I was mistaken. It affected my review. It's one of the largest mistakes I've ever made on this channel, and knowing I was wrong, thinking it continued off, drastically changes my opinions on that book and how it ended, and I think there is not a bad book within the Witcher series. Not even only a good book. I think they're all great. I love them. It checks so many boxes for me. Focusing on and fleshing out friendships, having an interesting, unique take on lore and characters, interacting with these monsters, having a greater philosophy, well-realized characters who have character consistency to them, an atmosphere that's continuous, plots that vary and evolve, and the stakes are forever rising. There's a crescendo here of how invested you are in what's going on here. Taking some risks as an author. The series of short stories is a refreshing break from the actual longer stories that happen within the series. I have my nitpicks with the Witcher series, but that's what they are, nitpicks. I couldn't defend in a debate The Witcher being the second best fantasy series of all time. This is purely off of raw enjoyment, so I get if people scoff a little bit at me putting it here, but if you want to know my tastes, I really dig these books. Not the biggest fan of the author, but I love the books. And number 1 for me, the fantasy series I love the most, surprising absolutely no one, is The Wheel of Time. And I'm going to go ahead and end the video here, because if you want to know why The Wheel of Time, for me, is the greatest fantasy series ever written, I'm going to go ahead and put a video right here. that'll pretty much go ahead and explain why I think you should read The Wheel of Time. But that is my current top 10 fantasy list. It's always up to change. If you ask me a week from now, the list might look rather different. But this is how I feel currently. I'd love to see your all's picks in the comments down below, and I will be going over them in a future video. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.